Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Is Racial Equality Unconstitutional? By Mark Golub, narrated by Bob Souer. Preface. This book was written almost entirely while Barack Obama was president. Its subject is not electoral politics, but race and constitutional law, and the central dynamic it wrestles with considerably predates the 2008 election. Nonetheless, President Obama has become a powerful symbol of how racial politics operates in the post-civil rights era, combining high-profile signs of progress and integration with entrenched racial disadvantage. Indeed, where I once found talk of post-civil rights racism likely to be greeted as novel or counterintuitive, the issues soon gained easy traction under the general problematic of race in the age of Obama. At a purely personal level, it then feels oddly appropriate that the end of the Obama era should coincide with final revisions and this book heading off to press. In this period, American common sense on matters of race was stretched even further to reconcile persistent disparities in social welfare, criminalization, and economic opportunity with a general understanding of itself as a post-racial society. And as advocates for racial equality increasingly found themselves laboring simply to establish the existence of the problem, I felt with rising urgency the need for progressive scholarship not only to counter the mythology of post-racial America, but to do so in a way that productively shifts the terms of debate rather than orienting around them. As a scholar of race and law, I am often asked to comment on court cases or political events that receive attention in the popular media. For years now, as a conservative Supreme Court has repeatedly demonstrated its eagerness to curtail civil rights protections, restrict the use of affirmative action, and gut enforceable provisions of the Voting Rights Act, when asked about the meaning or significance of such decisions, I've responded by quipping that many are bad for the country but good for my book. With the results of the November election, however, and the shocking mean-spiritedness of the campaign that preceded it, my bad for the country, good for my book quip seems to have turned suddenly unfunny. Witnessing the successful mobilization of right-wing populism under hyper-masculinist appeals to an unapologetic white nationalism, one cannot help but wonder whether the Obama era ends with a return to something from an earlier age. In 2016, at least, racist political appeals often were explicit and open, not coded or concealed, with seemingly no need for dog-whistling subtlety. To put things slightly differently, this book takes as its premise two seemingly contradictory facts about American politics and social relations. First, it is marked by near-universal acceptance of anti-racist norms, and so at least purports to extend equal care and concern for all of its members, irrespective of their race, gender, ethnicity, color, or creed. And second, it is fundamentally structured by relationships of racial domination and subordination. How these two elements of American identity and social structure can coexist is the larger puzzle to which the book responds. Prior to the election, the first premise seemed entirely uncontroversial, while the second was likely to generate resistance or critique. After the election, it is the second premise that seems most evident, while the first is called uncomfortably into question. For many who watched the Trump phenomenon grow from comical distraction to real but unlikely threat to new political reality, the most dispiriting part has been the realization that Trumpism reveals something about America that we either did not know or were unwilling to admit. But this book is not about Obama or Trump. It does not seek to explain the recent election, nor does it pretend to know or predict the actions of the new president or the decisions of a Supreme Court certain to be shaped by his appointments. Rather, it marks an intervention into a long-standing debate over the meaning and possibility of racial justice in American law and society. At the heart of this debate, I argue, is the highly mythologized figure of the color-blind Constitution. That the terms of debate principally have been set through a contest between advocates and critics of something called color-blindness has been profoundly unhelpful for understanding either the racially structured nature of American democracy or the race-intensifying effects of a formally colorblind rule. In naming race and constitutional law as my book's subject, I mean something greater than just case law and doctrine. Taking constitutionalism in its broadest sense of forming or constituting a political community, this book asks to what extent the American polity is created out of relationships of racial domination, and to what extent the constitutional vision of liberals and conservatives alike is shaped by an unwillingness to confront this basic premise. Accordingly, it may be understood as taking up Saidiya Hartman's painful challenge in Scenes of Subjection to theorize slavery and emancipation in terms of continuity rather than break. The figure of the colorblind constitution around which this book is organized first appeared as part of a dispute over what substantive rights African Americans might claim as a consequence of slavery's formal demise. Similarly, colorblindness achieved privileged status as a symbol of constitutional equality amid contentious debate over what substantive rights African Americans might claim as a consequence of Jim Crow's formal rejection, and so suggests both break and continuity between segregation and civil rights. So too with the closing of the Obama era and evident inauguration of the post-racial age. It is, of course, impossible to know the future of a Trump-appointed Supreme Court and federal judiciary, but the weight of American history suggests that our current moment may be understood less in terms of a return to the bad old days of open racism, registering, as it were, entirely as loss, and more as a reminder of continuities we prefer not to acknowledge. It is this underlying point of unrecognized or disavowed agreement that I mean to suggest by posing the question of this book's title: Is racial equality unconstitutional? The question is intended to be understood on two distinct levels, corresponding to the doubled possibility of meaning carried by the word constitutional. First, in its more limited sense, the question of constitutionality compares a particular law or policy with the requirements of the Basic Law, either as interpreted by the courts, as a speculative empirical question, or as courts ought to interpret it, as a political normative question. To pose the question in this familiar register is to ask whether some particular policy will or ought to be held in violation of, for example, the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And yet the question also serves to disrupt that familiarity, since people are likely to be accustomed to thinking of racial discrimination rather than equality as constitutionally prohibited. In this first sense of the question, my title asks whether the pursuit of racial equality as a substantive democratic goal is consistent with the court's current understanding of equal protection. I argue that it is not, even when pursued by facially neutral policies that do not classify individuals by race, and even though advocates of colorblind constitutionalism would surely disavow this conclusion. One of the book's contributions in this practical sense is to show how the logic of colorblindness compels results that even its authors acknowledge to be unacceptable, and how liberal critics of the doctrine nonetheless have been captured by its terms. But the title also plays at a second and more fundamental level, in which the language of the Constitution marks the bringing into being of a political community or people. To ask whether racial equality is unconstitutional in this second constitutive sense of the term is to call into question the status of the American polity as forged by racial exclusion, indeed as constituted by that exclusion, and so fundamentally at odds with genuine equality and racial democracy. Posed this way, the question exceeds the domain of Supreme Court doctrine and goes to the core of the constitutional dilemma instigated by the structuring role of race in the American constitutional order. Where virtually all existing critiques of colorblindness point to the need for greater awareness of racism's lingering effects, my argument instead calls attention to the peculiar racial logic at work in the demand for colorblindness itself. In so doing, I raise the possibility that racial equality cannot be the perfection of the American democratic project. I hold this view, moreover, whether racial progress is conceived as elusive, inevitable, or already achieved, and whether it is offered cynically in claims of post-racial America, or hopefully as a call to action that we may achieve a more perfect union. Rather, meaningful equality will require a more radical break from American constitutional order and refounding upon principles of racial democracy. This book is offered in the spirit of bringing the need for such a break and its possibility more clearly into view. Part 1. The Race-Conscious Logic of Colorblind Constitutionalism. Chapter 1. Beyond Colorblindness and Color Consciousness. Discussions of race in American law and politics remain captured by the figure of the colorblind Constitution. From its origins in a dispute over the proper interpretation of the 14th Amendment, its influence extends far beyond the realm of legal doctrine and has emerged as the central metaphor of the post-civil rights era. Its symbolism profoundly shapes popular understandings of race, law, justice, and equality, and for many Americans embodies a kind of collective racial common sense. The phrase lays claim to the Constitution in the strong sense of constituting a political community, not only in terms of what the written Constitution means, or should mean, but also in terms of who we are as a nation, in what we believe, and to what we aspire. Even for those who reject its claim, the language of colorblindness sets the terms of debate, making its presence felt implicitly even in challenges to its constitutional authority. It is not surprising, therefore, that extensive literatures in law and legal studies, ethics and philosophy, history, and the social sciences have supplied a vast array of arguments for or against colorblindness and the colorblind Constitution. For its proponents, colorblindness represents an ideal of equal treatment under law and a principled rejection of policies that classify or treat individuals differently on the basis of race. The phrase itself traces to Justice John Marshall Harlan's dissenting opinion in Plessy v. Ferguson, the 1896 case that upheld the constitutionality of state-mandated racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. Rejecting that view, Justice Harlan famously declared, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." Discerning just what Harlan meant by this phrase is a complex question that I take up in more detail in Chapter 3, but today his words are generally understood to condemn all forms of race-based decision-making by the state. Adapting Justice Harlan's phrase for the title of his book, for example, Andrew Cole's The Colorblind Constitution traces the history of this austere proposition that the Constitution denies government the power to distinguish between its citizens on the basis of race. The intuitive appeal of this view derives from its close connection with liberal political theory and related values of abstract individualism, moral autonomy, and procedural justice. Liberalism, and American liberalism especially so, conceives itself to be born of a fundamental abhorrence of formal status hierarchies. Historically, of course, the nation's political order has never fully conformed to these self-stated ideals. But for advocates of the colorblind Constitution, that fact simply confirms the validity of the principle itself. The meaning of constitutional equality is measured, they hold, by historical injuries sustained through lack of adherence to colorblindness in practice. The rightness of the colorblind Constitution, say its champions, is on display precisely in the wrongness of slavery, segregation, prejudice, and discrimination. Rejecting the use of race in policy and legal decision-making, it is argued, is the best and perhaps only way to achieve the colorblind ideal now and in the future. Chief Justice Roberts expresses this view in the form of a judicial maxim when he writes, "The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race." For some, there is evidence that the civil rights revolution has largely accomplished its goals. The unprecedented rise of a black middle class, visible signs of integration and diversity in the workplace and social spheres, widespread and sincere condemnation of explicitly racist views and public use of demeaning racial epithets, and, of course, the formerly unthinkable, the historic election of an African-American president. And yet a defining element of the post-civil rights era is that these accomplishments coexist with trends that are both well-known and difficult to reconcile with the optimistic progress narrative of post-racial America. Persistent or growing material inequality in almost all measurable categories of social welfare, massive and unprecedented expansion of racialized surveillance, and a prison system that disproportionately incarcerates black and brown bodies. Widespread public support for draconian immigration laws and militarization of national borders, indefinite detention and deportation, justified under the rubric of anti-terrorism, coordinated programs of racially targeted voter suppression, the continuing vulnerability of black bodies to police violence and private acts of racial terrorism. How is it that these two trends can coexist? How are the former signs of racial progress reconciled with the later indications of entrenched racial domination? And what could it mean, then, to be colorblind in the post-civil rights era when formal institutions of segregation are repudiated while material inequalities between races are steadfastly preserved? This book is not meant to persuade those who believe or purport to believe in a post-racial America where racism is largely a relic of the past. Rather, I start from assumptions not likely to be shared by those who hold such a view, joining a tradition of anti-racist scholarship defined at minimum by an acknowledgement that race matters historically, socially, and politically rather than biologically, that racial hierarchy has been a persistent and defining feature of American democracy, and that democratic commitments as well as simple human solidarity oblige us morally and legally to confront racial inequality in all of its forms. In venturing to write about the role of law in reproducing racial subordination in the United States, my thinking both grows out of and hopes to contribute to this tradition. More specifically, my project is motivated by a concern that anti-racist criticism too often has been defined by the object of its critique and so offers inadequate tools for resisting it. Even when it is rejected, that is, color-blindness discourse sets the terms of debate, defines normative goals, and limits the scope of legitimacy for alternative formulations of racial justice. Against its overwhelming popular and political success, for example, critics of colorblind constitutionalism have labored to justify color-conscious policies and legal principles. In pursuing color consciousness as an alternative, however, this strategy concedes an underlying assumption that colorblindness marks a refusal of racial consciousness rather than its mobilization. On this view, colorblindness is understood to supply a cramped and narrow constitutional vision that serves chiefly to disqualify many of the tools that could helpfully be engaged to combat persistent racial inequality in the United States. Color consciousness is justified, it is argued, because blindness to race risks fostering blindness to racism, and so functions to perpetuate current inequalities not easily separated from the explicitly white supremacist practices of the past. Colorblind constitutionalism renders invisible the legacy of these practices, past and present, while falsely equating race-conscious remedies with the white supremacy they aim to combat. In the post-civil rights era, say its critics, colorblind constitutionalism perpetuates racial hierarchy and undermines policies that would confront entrenched racial privilege. Race-conscious decision-making is therefore justified as necessary to confront historical and present racial injustices. Justice Blackmun expresses this view in the form of a judicial maxim when he writes, "In order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race." In what follows, I seek to disrupt the terms of this debate rather than taking a side. For while I agree with critics that colorblind constitutionalism serves as a tool for justifying and reproducing racial inequality, I also worry that arguments in favor of color consciousness have implicitly reproduced the underlying premises of the colorblind view. When race-based decision-making is condemned as a departure from colorblind norms, and when it is defended as a necessary alternative to them, this limiting dichotomy tends to obscure the underlying racial logic of colorblind constitutionalism itself. Both sides, that is, regard race-conscious remedies such as affirmative action as a departure from colorblind norms. Whether that departure is justified is the subject of their dispute. It is this shared assumption rather than their disagreement that this book aims to challenge. A more robust defense of racial equality begins, I argue, with an understanding of how the imposition of a colorblind rule in itself affects a heightened awareness of race, and so ought to be conceived as a particular form of color consciousness rather than an alternative to it. My approach thus differs substantially from those working within the familiar terms of popular and academic debate, framed as they are by the stark choice between colorblindness and color consciousness in legal and political decision-making. Advocates of racial consciousness have shown how colorblindness limits the scope of permissible state action to remedy entrenched racial inequality, and so fails to produce a racially egalitarian society. This much explains why colorblindness is normatively undesirable, and why it is preferable to take account of race. What it fails to explain is how prohibitions against racial classifications already do take account of race and so are, in themselves, already profoundly race-conscious. Colorblindness is not a meaningful option in societies structured by racial hierarchy. The choice is not between blindness and consciousness, I argue, but between two distinct modes of racial awareness, whether our racial consciousness will take the form of a prohibition or an engagement, and whether it will seek to preserve racial hierarchy or to transform it. Viewed this way, the problem with colorblindness is not that it prohibits consideration of race, but that it expands racial consideration on behalf of purportedly victimized whites. Within its terms, the pursuit of racial equality registers as injury, loss, or constitutional violation. This interpretation inverts familiar understandings of race, rights, and the Constitution, according to which the law is figured as a protector of racial minorities against majoritarian excess. In contrast, my argument identifies racial hierarchy rather than equality as an enduring constitutional norm, thus posing the question of the book's title, Is Racial Equality Unconstitutional? The following sections seek to explain how and in what sense this question bears an affirmative answer, first at the level of doctrine, and then as a matter of ideology or racial formation. Anti-classification, anti-discrimination, anti-subordination. In legal scholarship and as used by legal professionals, the colorblind Constitution is understood to organize a way of thinking about the permissibility of racial classifications by the state. Framed this way, colorblindness refers less to a constitutional theory than to a legal doctrine, the aim of which is to establish consistent rules regarding the use of race in law and public policy. As a general principle, the doctrine has been championed by a majority of the Supreme Court, but has never been adopted as an absolute rule. Even for its ardent champions, exceptions are allowed in a limited number of cases, to remedy the effects of specific prior discriminatory state actions, to promote diversity in higher education, in voting, as a relevant factor in the redistricting process, and in emergency situations such as prisons and matters of national security. Nor has anti-classification always been regarded as the natural, obvious, or dominant meaning of anti-discrimination law. Rather, as Reva Siegel has shown, our current understanding of the anti-classification principle is in fact an artifact of political struggles over the meaning of anti-discrimination after Brown v. Board of Education. Nonetheless, recent Supreme Court decisions suggest a growing consensus around some version of the colorblind principle. As doctrine, the colorblind rule can be evaluated from the perspective of three understandings of equal protection law: anti-classification, anti-discrimination, and anti-subordination. According to the Court's more conservative members, anti-classification is simply a literal articulation of anti-discrimination. On this view, it is the act of classifying by race that offends the Constitution, rather than the result or purpose to which a classification is put. As Justice Thomas writes, the Constitution abhors classifications based on race, not only because those classifications can harm favored races or are based on illegitimate motives, but also because every time the government places citizens on racial registers and makes race relevant to the provision of burdens or benefits, it demeans us all. Colorblind constitutionalism thus describes a conservative judicial philosophy, while nonetheless finding justification for its view in a strong version of political liberalism, with its attention to the rights of individuals, private choices, and free markets. For Justice Thomas and others who support this view, the Constitution guarantees every individual the right to be treated as an individual. Because they make race relevant, racial classifications are said to violate this basic principle and are therefore unconstitutional. But liberal values of individualism and equal treatment need not imply the illegitimacy or illegality of racial classifications in some contexts. A second vision of constitutional equality, also grounded in the principle of anti-discrimination, regards race as a permissible and at times necessary basis of decision-making to ensure fair treatment and meaningful equality of opportunity for all individuals. Paul Brest's classic formulation, for example, defines the anti-discrimination principle as the general principle disfavoring classifications and other decisions and practices that depend on the race or ethnic origin of the parties affected. Yet while many race-based decisions will reflect impermissible assumptions of racial value and racially selected indifference, Brest notes others may not and may even constitute desirable uses of race, such as the integration of formally segregated schools. On this version of the anti-discrimination principle, the harm of discrimination adheres not in the act of racial classification, but in the injuries they traditionally have worked. In distinguishing between colorblind means and ends, the liberal anti-discrimination position conceptualizes racial classification as instrumentally rather than intrinsically harmful. As a consequence, it also sets the terms by which some forms of racial classification could be justified. If race consciousness is morally suspect because it treats people as members of groups rather than as individuals, and so denies them treatment with equal dignity and respect, then surely society has a compelling interest in minimizing the extent to which race correlates with traditional measures of life opportunity. In this sense, it is the failure to acknowledge and address racial injustice that violates principles of democratic individualism. On this view, the legally and morally objectionable feature of discrimination is tightly drawn to the inegalitarian social order through which racial categories are imbued with meaning. Government use of racial classifications in public policy is not what makes race relevant today, and to the extent that inegalitarian social organization contributes to the salience of racial categories, race-conscious policies that promote integration or minimize the racial concentration of socially valuable goods may in fact help bring about the kind of society in which race matters less. On this account, anti-discrimination and race consciousness need not be in tension. That they so often are thought to be in conflict reflects the mistaken assumption that racial consciousness is a product of the classifications themselves, rather than a reflection of an unjust social organization. As Amy Gutman has argued, color-conscious policies may be consistent with the ideal of a colorblind society if they have the effect of bringing such a situation into being. Some color-conscious policies and some kinds of color consciousness may minimize injustice today and make it possible to be both fair and colorblind in the future. Understood aspirationally, that is, colorblind ideals may at times authorize color-conscious practices. On the liberal understanding of anti-discrimination, colorblindness represents a vision of how a fair society ought to be structured, but does not justify a categorical prohibition against racial classifications in a society such as our own, that is, one in which racial hierarchy and prejudice are pervasive. Race-conscious policies that would be unfair in an ideal society may well be justified in our imperfect world, Ronald Dworkin contends, when they serve to reduce the degree to which American society is overall a racially conscious society. At first glance, liberal and conservative formulations of anti-discrimination would appear to be diametrically opposed. After all, the liberal model is intended to justify precisely those race-conscious policies that colorblind conservatives reject as unconstitutional. And yet the arguments reveal a surprising level of agreement. Whether viewed as an impermissible introduction of race that ensures its continued relevance, the conservative view, or as a valuable method for decreasing the salience of race in contemporary society, the liberal view, the legitimacy or illegitimacy of race-conscious policies in both cases turns upon its imagined relationship to an idealized, non-racial American society. In this sense, and despite its prescriptive justification of race-conscious policies such as affirmative action, the liberal formulation of anti-discrimination may just as easily be described as a kind of aspirational colorblindness. The true measure of colorblind constitutionalism's victory, then, is its implicit acceptance even by ostensible critics who are left to justify temporary departures from a colorblind norm, and to do so on the promise of a more colorblind future. By recognizing this underlying convergence in liberal and conservative anti-discrimination law, it is perhaps easier to see how colorblindness discourse might supply the rhetorical tools with which simultaneously to challenge and defend entrenched racial hierarchy. Indeed, the concern that both liberal aspirational and conservative anti-classification versions of anti-discrimination will prove inadequate to the task of challenging systemic inequality motivates a third approach to equal protection law, anti-subordination theory. Initially put forward by Owen Fiss as the group disadvantaging principle, this view holds that the Equal Protection Clause ought not to be understood to protect individuals against discrimination, a phrase notably.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?